Welcome to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. Here, we'll dig deep into the pressing topics of housing in America. And while we do that, we'll also get to know some of the people who've devoted their lives to seeking tangible, impactful, and achievable solutions. In today's episode, we welcome industry stakeholders who participated in a webinar about adaptive reuse of commercial and retail spaces into affordable housing in a post-pandemic world. It was sponsored by NeighborWorks America. What follows is a condensed version of the discussion with the complete conversation available for viewing at nhc.org. As we continue to look forward to the new normal in a post-pandemic landscape, we know that our cities and neighborhoods are likely to change to an extent and in ways we cannot predict. The pandemic caused a shift in how and where we live and work. Offices were closed. Employees worked from homes in unprecedented numbers, often overnight. Many will continue to work from home, predominantly or permanently, after the pandemic is over. These changes have left us with empty buildings and unused spaces. Adaptive reuse offers a way for housing developers to utilize existing structures that are otherwise decommissioned in order to build new housing and develop communities. It develops much needed housing while utilizing vacant space that otherwise does not serve the community. Today's panel will offer insight on how to successfully pursue adaptive reuse projects, how to make them financially feasible, and what redevelopment of spaces can mean for shifting populations. Our discussion today is moderated by Mike Kinsella, CEO of Up for Growth, and we're going to open the program with a presentation by David Garcia, Policy Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley.
Turner Center is a housing research and policy organization at UC Berkeley. We focus on really all manners of housing, from the cost of construction to land use reform to program evaluations as well. But today we're here to talk about our recent work on the conversion of commercial property into residential. So really, it's important to understand why this is necessary to examine. The pandemic has presented us with a lot of changes in the way that we live our day-to-day lives. And in some cases, these changes are presenting us with new opportunities to create housing in a way that could be beneficial for affordable housing, market rate housing, and also aligning with important economic development and climate change mitigation goals. But specifically, these opportunities have to do with a accelerated shift to e-commerce. And so as a result, we have a lot of retail centers, strip malls, things like that are at this point underutilized and may never return to their former full occupancy as brick and mortar places. And so it gives us an opportunity to reposition these as housing. It's important to look at specifically adaptive reuse because, again, it is almost always an infill type of project, right? It's generally going to be close to jobs, close to amenities and parks and schools, more so than outward growth would provide. And so adaptive reuse can really provide us not just with an opportunity to create housing, but an opportunity to create housing in a way that aligns with many of our other policy goals. And so that's why we've been particularly interested in this topic. And over the past 18 months, we've had a series of papers on this general topic, from understanding the characteristics of where this land is located, are they in high opportunity areas, are they in walkable communities, things like that, but also the likelihood that underutilized retail and office parcels will actually be converted. And basically, this research was done in consultation with practitioners who are actively pursuing these projects or have done them in the past. So to start, we looked at the architectural features, right? What are the characteristics of the buildings themselves that lend themselves to successful adaptive reuse projects? I think there's an idea that we can basically turn any building into housing, and I think with enough money that's true. But actually, there are a series of of characteristics that really lend themselves to adaptive reuse that we were trying to focus in on with this work. And so things like shallow floor plates are really important for light and air requirements. Many times office buildings have really deep floor plates, which means that we have to cut through the center of the buildings to create light wells or atriums, and which will oftentimes trigger the relocation of mechanical systems and whatnot, and that gets really expensive. We also noted that a lot of times in buildings that were built before 1980, there's a lot of remediation that has to happen. We also noted that there are a lot of systems that need to be replaced in older buildings that oftentimes cost just as much as it would in a new construction project, sometimes more. There needs to be a large enough building footprint in order to make a project really work, right? So we found that the sweet spot was around 50 units to fit into an existing building in order for that project to work successfully on the market. We also found that land use and code flexibility are really important to making these projects work. And a lot of times our existing code requirements are not situated well to really work for adaptive reuse. So things like parking requirements might not work, particularly in an urban setting where you don't have a surface parking lot next door. So to the extent that localities can create some flexibility in their codes or create specific ordinances for adaptive reuse, that really makes these projects worthwhile. Another thing we noted is that by leveraging the fact that there is an existing building in the community, that can really help with opposition to new projects. As we know, in certain places, there is significant opposition to the creation of new housing, but with adaptive reuse, oftentimes you can get community support for the reuse of the building that maybe was sitting vacant before. There are other issues, though, that can work against a project. So, for example, you may have an existing building that is underzoned, right? So it may be more financially advantageous to tear the building down and build much higher if the zoning allows for that. We also just know that there's general uncertainty around what the construction costs are going to be. Again, it's really hard to predict what you're going to run into in an older building. So through this work, we had a couple recommendations. And the first is, again, local ordinances are so important to making these projects work. They can be tailored to what that specific community is looking for and can help create more flexibility to meet building code requirements or other things that otherwise might be somewhat onerous for an adaptive use project to meet and be successful. The last thing we note is that funding to support adaptive reuse projects is oftentimes really key, right? So things like the historic tax credits. So there are definitely, from policy perspective, things we can do to make these projects work better. And again, really, this is going to be really important for us as we look to kind of a new reality where retail and commercial development or existing structures are just not utilized as much as they would have been in the past. And so really important to think creatively about how to get these projects to work and how to get them to work within the existing framework of our land use regulations, right?
Hi, I'm Amy Kashani. I'm a Senior Vice President of Real Estate Development with Pastone Corporation. We are a regional nonprofit in upstate New York. Skyview Park Apartments. This is a affordable senior development within the blighted, vacant Arundecoit Mall in upstate New York. It is a partnership with our local hospital, Rochester Regional Health, to provide services for frail elderly. I'll talk a little, what I'm going to discuss a little bit is a little bit of the history of the town of Arundecoit, because when we decide to do something, especially in adaptive reuse, we need to have a market and we need to understand our market. So the town of Arundecoit was founded in 1839. It was one of the first suburbs of the city of Rochester, Metro Rochester. And in the early 50s and 60s, a lot of the people that moved in there were young families, basically because they wanted to get away from the city, but they needed to be relatively close. By the 70s, most of the residents that were there 70% of them were still the residents that moved in the 50s, but their children had moved on, but they stayed there because their friends were there. We had an elderly population, or primarily elderly population, in the town of Arundecoit already. We also had services, because as people aged, the services started coming. We had elder care providers, we had hospital, health facilities, a local hospital, doctor's offices, restaurants, shopping, transit. It was on a bus line. It was close because it was the first suburb. It was close to the city of Rochester, and yet it had access to all the other suburbs. So it was pretty centrally located. So then we go to the Arundecoit Mall, which was located in the town of Arundecoit, in the primary artery of the town of Arundecoit. It was constructed in 1990, and it was one of the largest malls, two-story indoor malls in upstate New York at the time. It had housed approximately 10 acres of land and could house up to 110 stores. It was easy access to downtown. It was by the expressway. It was right off the artery. It had wonderful walking space so the seniors could get their exercise. It had restaurants. It had shops. People would go there just to visit with their friends. By late 1990s, large chains began to merge, and there wasn't such a need for large retail space. So the mall started losing tenants. And then to add to that, the mall was, because of its proximity to a city, there was a rumor that there was danger in the area, there was crime. It was never substantiated, but the word got out, and it affected the people coming to the mall. So more stores started vacating. And by 2016, the last anchor store, Sears, shut down, and the mall was totally vacant from 2016. Pat Stone was interested in redevelopment, in developing additional housing for seniors in Arundecoit, because we knew that there was a market. We already had a senior development in Arundecoit, and we had a huge waiting list. So it was an ideal place to develop and to continue to develop senior housing. However, because it was one of the first suburbs, there was a lack of suitable vacant land for the construction of new development that would be in an ideal location, easily accessible to everything. So then we looked at other options for development, and adaptive reuse was an opportunity that we wanted to explore. And what better place to do it in the mall, within the mall, because there was sufficient space that we could creatively develop and house and accommodate senior living. We could meet the housing need and the ability for seniors to really age in place. So as a result of that, we developed 157 units total. For us, the economy of scale was 157 units. But we did take the Sears building, the Sears box store, and that was the one that we decided to develop. Because it was an adaptive reuse, there was no way we were going to get 157 units in that building. So what we did was we worked on the Sears adaptive reuse, and we were able to maximize the unit size to 73 units. But we needed more. So what we added an adjacent new construction building to house the balance of the units, the 84 units. And we connected them via a skywalk so that no one felt that they were not part of the whole thing. Our goal was to provide a project where people could really, truly age in place. So what we did then was we partnered with the local hospital, Rochester Regional Health, and they were our supportive services partner, and they're providing services for frail elderly. We went to the county and we got a little bit of money. We went to the town, and because they had suffered so much, they agreed to give us money. They also agreed to give us a pilot. We got money funding from ESHI, which was a supportive housing program. We were able to receive some incentives for energy efficiency, and we got tax credits. So what's happening since our project was developed? The town actually put in their community center. And because of not only the senior population in our project, but because of the large senior population in the community, one floor is dedicated on the community center only to the seniors. And the local hospital put in their School of Nursing program, which is at another anchor store, which is great for our project. And the local senior community center put in a senior daycare center in the project. So things are starting to move in the direction it needs to be moved in. We were lucky that NeighborWorks was helped us to analyze the project, because as Mike said, that there's you really have to do a feasibility analysis, and you have to do it in depth for an adaptive reuse. It's not a simple feasibility analysis.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Kingsella. I'm the CEO of Up for Growth. As many of you know, we are a national cross-sector member network that is laser focused on solving America's housing shortage and affordability crisis through data-driven research and evidence-based policy. Today, we're interested in having a really interactive and engaging dialogue on this issue, exploring challenges, exploring opportunities through public policy to really get more homes built through the reuse and conversion of underutilized assets. Antoine, you hail from Detroit, obviously have an experience in both architecture and also working in public policy in your role at the city of Detroit. So could you share with us sort of what the landscape looks like in your town? What are your experiences in community and economic development in Detroit, and what role does adaptive reuse play in terms of addressing housing needs for your community?
I serve as a director of planning and development for the city of Detroit. I've been here for just short of a year after doing a number of planning and design activities, as well as community development in the city of Houston. The city of Detroit offers a phenomenal opportunity for adaptive reuse. Many people are aware that we have excellent large scale and smaller scale buildings that some of them have been vacant for several decades. But they have presented us the opportunity to revisit and redeliver units for housing, affordable housing, senior housing, as well as for commercial activities.
I know that adaptive reuse of buildings are one thing, but the adaptive reuse of public places are another, and the investments in transportation and specifically your streetcar system in the plaza there in the center of the city is quite remarkable. And on that note, I'd like to turn over to Abigail with the National League of Cities. And Abigail, you've done a lot of work, not only of thinking about housing and adaptive reuse, but really adaptive reuse and repositioning and leverage of great public places. Abigail, one question for you is, how are your member cities thinking about community assets like jobs, transit, other amenities as it builds out its policies and really thinks about leveraging existing buildings for, let's say, more housing production?
My name is Abigail Mangar. I'm a Health and Resilience Program Manager at NLC, and we mostly are a member organization of thinking about those smaller towns, smaller medium cities, as well as some rural towns, to offer them guidance and technical support on addressing issues such as housing and economic development. And so when we think about these ideas of adapting reuse of public spaces, you see the process of how you would approach thinking about adaptive reuse, of reconsidering the function of a place, is really similar to what we saw at the start of the pandemic, of people starting to reimagine what public space can look like. So we're taking a shift to know that these kind of static forms of how we've looked at our roads, our streets, our buildings, what's inside buildings can actually be more flexible if we give it a chance with our policies. But I think it can be very daunting. So I think there has to be a lot of care and consideration of those local governments where you might have just one government employee who is the housing staff member for the whole city. And for them, how do you tell them about this concept of adaptive reuse, of let's reconsider the way you've been doing this process for years, maybe even decades?
And maybe to both Antoine and Abigail, as you think about placemaking and areas of opportunity, I'm just curious if you could comment on sort of how you think about policies to support not only more housing, but creating opportunity for folks and for communities that maybe in the past haven't been in receiving the kinds of investment that other places have.
First of all, we made a concerted effort in 2014 and in 2017. We doubled down to launch something called the Strategic Neighborhood Fund, which was created. Essentially, it's a public-private partnership where many of our corporate entities came together and gave funds specifically for the development of infrastructure and for housing and park areas outside of the downtown core. We started with 3 areas in 2014. In 2017, we launched 7 more areas. And I call them areas because each area is a collection of neighborhoods. So it's not just one neighborhood. And the overall, that was a contribution between all 10 of those areas. It's a contribution of $63 million by our corporate sector. And we were able to leverage over another $157 million in philanthropic and public support. So overall, we had a $200+ million infusion leading to development in these areas. Additionally, on one of our major corridors in the very first iteration of this on Livernois, which was often called the Avenue of Fashion, it's often referred to as the oldest African-American commercial district in the country. And it led to the creation now of 18 new African-American owned small businesses just along this 1.5 mile corridor.
Amy, we really appreciated your case study, and I think David Garcia spoke to this in his initial presentation. Often the conversion of buildings that were built for other purposes, like offices or shopping centers, are quite expensive, right? Curious how you think about different product types within the commercial category, retail, industrial, office. Do certain types lend themselves more to redevelopment, repurposing of housing? Are there opportunities to expand the suitability for properties for conversion with different tools in the toolbox?
Well, firstly, when we did our adaptive reuse and when we do any of very complicated projects, we bring our team in from the beginning. We bring our engineer in, we bring our architect in, we bring our general contractor in. And as a team, we carefully analyze the feasibility of the development. We're not going to get everything. We're not going to understand everything until we get into the building, but we try and do a really good job at catching as many things that may be costly items as we can in advance. And where we don't have the funding, we try to do work with value engineering, and that's why it's critical that the whole team is part of the analysis. The other thing that we looked at was this was part of a mall, and this was part of a blighted mall. So we really took a chance to go into this mall and develop senior housings. So the location of the development is really critical as well, because that way, should the mall not succeed, you can still sustain yourself and have access to the outside. instead of sharing some of the utility costs, we opted to have our own utility lines going through. So we're independent within the mall. Those are ways that we could kind of hedge ourselves and protect ourselves, and ways that we could kind of know what our costs are. The best you can do is to bring together a team in advance, a qualified team, and analyze everything.
So I'm curious, it sounds like from Amy's perspective, there's a lot of the challenge is the unknown. What's behind the wall? When was the building built? Is there or are there not environmental challenges? Of course, Detroit has quite a bit of diversity in its sort of architectural character and overall building stock. How active do you get? Do you have any approaches from a city perspective to mitigate that risk for folks looking to adapt and reposition existing buildings?
As you noted, we have a significant amount and a variety of abandoned facilities, but we are taking them approach. We have a residential approach, and we also have what we're calling an industrial approach. We're not turning our back on our industrial nature and history of the city, but rather embracing it and using it as a real asset to the city. The Fisher body plant, which had been vacant for about 25 years and was the home for making essentially the bodies of Chevys and a couple of other entities, now is going to turn into a 400 plus unit residential facility. It's a $134 million project. It's the largest African-American led project in the city of Detroit's history, but it was a collaborative effort by that developer team, but we also provided support and CDBG grants, funding. There's some LIHTC funding in there. There's some historic tax credits. So we're working with the developer community to not only take blighted, facilities off the rolls, if you will, but also to help them, accumulate the capital stack, right?
Abigail, would love to go over to you. I mean, I want to put this all in perspective and just sort of ground ourselves again and, the why behind this conversation of commercial to residential. I mean, I think a big part of the challenge municipal leaders like Antoine are driving at is, our nation is experiencing an affordability crisis that is at unprecedented levels, at least in the last 50 years. As you think about your membership and, we're talking about, suburban New York, we're talking about downtown Detroit. I'm curious, as you think about, let's say, more middle market, exurban, or even rural communities, are you seeing these opportunities, adaptive reuse, revitalization, coming more to the fore as a strategy to address affordability?
I think a lot of our members are really open to wanting to see what they can do based on NLC having expertise in people with housing, people with community development, and also folks on the legislative side. So I think the idea of members being open to hearing about how do we solve these problems, I think for them, it's more so we understand this problem is existing and we've heard some ideas of solutions, but we need case examples of hearing from people who are just like us, other local governments. Tell me how they financed it. Tell me what policies or tax credits that they needed to have in place to make it happen. Tell me the stakeholders who were involved in the process. What did the timeline look like? So I think for them, the biggest barrier is first, like making sure you have awareness of sharing those ideas like adaptive reuse with them, but then offering them guidance on who are people who are just of a similar geographic area as us, similar of a size government as us, of staff availability to go and address these problems.
Do you think one potential benefit of adaptive reuse is potentially circumventing NIMBYism or opposition to new housing? In other words, Amy, did you run into less resistance on repurposing a Sears for senior affordable housing than if you were building strictly ground up Antoine, curious, obviously very different dynamics in Detroit than Berkeley, but, curious if you have any opportunities to compare, contrast, approval processes and some of the more discretionary processes with neighborhood groups in adaptive reuse versus ground up.
All I can really say is it depends on the exact product and it depends on the community you're working in.
Antoine, any perspectives from your years, both at the city and before being at the city?
What I found is that NIMBYs exist everywhere, no matter what the project is, and no matter what even the community benefits may be. What we've been having some success with in Detroit is effective and consistent community engagement. And so when we involve our residents long-term and consistently, they're beginning to believe that the city actually has their desires and their needs at heart. But one of the challenges with new development, whether it's new construction or adaptive reuse, we're quote unquote bringing more people to an area. And usually it's been the minority. People really appreciate that we're reactivating existing facilities, and actually really do like the fact that we're re-inhabiting these entities that have a cultural resonance with many of the neighbors.
And Abigail, I'll kind of want to reframe for you because you're focused really on public spaces. What's your sense of the value of investing in that public realm, and what role can it play in garnering support from a community for more housing as part of broader revitalization efforts?
One of the big ideas that people might not even realize is that they're for it, but they don't even see it. There is these misconceptions of there's single family houses, and then there's this mysterious other that we've been like fear mongered about of multifamily housing. And they don't realize these places that are mixed use development that have commercial mixed with residential, the work, play, live areas are missing middle housing. So when we think about the values of what people learned from the pandemic of the outdoor dining, kind of reusing public spaces, being able to walk to services they want, the 15-minute city, these are values that connect to what missing middle housing and adaptive reuse can bring more of. So I think it has a lot to do with first, kind of like demystifying a little bit. So I think the values of reimagining public spaces offers those ideals of what we're thinking about with adaptive reuse. And so the process is how we're thinking about, let's talk to the community, engage with them to understand what are the values of what you care about in this space that you want to see here.
Thank you, Abigail. But I'm going to do a lightning round with the three panelists right now, which is if the federal government could do one thing to catalyze more adaptive reuse, more housing being built out of these older, let's say underutilized properties, what would that be? Amy, since you're a developer, I will start with you.
Well, since I'm a developer, more funding so that we can close gaps quicker and we can produce more.
Abigail, any thoughts from a federal perspective?
It's interesting to me, we have this language of saying the pandemic showcased the housing crisis, as well as so many people are working from home, and we're not seeing like, there's a lot of empty spaces, and there's also a lot of people who are not downtown. Let's put this together. So I think of reinforcing that there's opportunity here, and also the community revitalization fund that had already been brought up by the administration.
Antoine?
Gail and Amy gave some great examples, and so I will agree with both of them and throw a bit of a curveball. One thing we're looking at here in Detroit is a revisiting of the affordability index. As many people know, we describe affordability by AMI, and that's how, the threshold is 80%. And if we deliver households at 80% or below, then we are delivering affordability. Well, the household AMI in the city of Detroit is roughly half than it is for the state of Michigan, right? And so When we're able to deliver homes and units at 80% of AMI, they still may not be affordable to households that need it. And so we're really trying to find out of the box thinking to address that so we can move forward.
Well, on to the open Q&A. Is it easier to do adaptive reuse in urban places, or is it possible in suburban places as well? Amy, maybe you have some thoughts on that front.
I come from the mindset the same. Mixed use is adaptive reuse using the mixed use concept is a better approach. And I also think it really does, from my perspective, it really doesn't matter. It's just you have to find the need for both the economic need and for the residential need.
The AARP released a study last year that said at least 70% of seniors want to age in place. And so when you think about that growing population who desire to stay in their same communities, are you creating areas where they have the resources they need? They're going to need easy access to healthcare services, to groceries, to transportation, and adaptive reuse allows them to be near those services that are really vital for their health and well-being.
Affordable housing seems great, but I hear you need to be an established firm with a ton of lawyers to keep things straight. What is the feasibility for folks starting out, e.g. leaving a company to start their own development firm, to pull off one of these deals? Would a new developer have a chance? And I want to go to you, Antoine.
I can tell you, I can't speak for every municipality, but we work with developers at every scale. We have developers that are coming in and doing duplexes. We have developers that are coming in and doing $100 million deals. Quite frankly, most of the developers that come in are coming in at the lower scale, right? I'm not sure who the person spoke to. Really the need for attorneys comes in and the complexity of the deal if it's a much more expensive deal. But as far as making a duplex or making a quadplex, if you will, you'd be surprised how linear that process can be. Now, what I do tell developers, especially new ones, there are tools available and accessible for you if this is your first time out. There is some due diligence that I suggest for all new developers to follow, but it does not nearly have to be as cost prohibitive, at least in our market, as people may believe.
I'm going to go back to Amy with one of the additional questions for her. What was the affordability term for your project in New York? How did you initially reach out to the mall to begin the project? And I think I saw another related question in the chat, which is, how did you get the owner of the property to say a part of the property and not all of it?
So we all came from that town, as did the owner of the mall. So we kind of all knew each other, and we approached, as a team, we approached the owner with our concept. What he did is he directed us to a couple of the anchor buildings. This was not an easy feat, and I'm not going to say it's easy because this is, we are a nonprofit and he is a for-profit entity, so his mission is a little different than ours. But what we did was we structured an ownership, a site control. That was not what I typically structure with any of my deals, only because he did not want to give up rights to the whole mall. So we structured an acquisition price for the improvements of the mall, for the building, and a ground lease for the ground under the building. And that's how we were able to strike a deal. The affordability term was 50 years. So our ground lease had to go beyond 50 years. And so we have a 95-year ground lease. So that's how we structured it.
One question, and maybe for Abigail, what about adaptive reuse of massive adjacent parking lots next to, let's say, obsolete strip malls? Any thoughts on this question about conversion of parking to housing?
There is the idea of the third place of places that bring you joy, like placemaking concepts. And so, yes, there's this opportunity of seeing those types of parking lots as housing, but I think part of it might come of doing these like smaller investments of first showing like how to use parking spaces to show value in other purposes. And then once you're able to show the flexibility of if we use parking in different ways on a smaller scale, it might be able to show more investment of why it's necessary to think of it from a larger context, such as housing. I think your biggest barrier is thinking about how do we either remove or adjust the parking minimum requirement that many cities have across the country.
I want to jump over back to Antoine. Generally, what are the experience of folks with, the cost to put in kitchens and bathrooms and plumbing and buildings for residential, much more intensive use than office. So, what are you seeing as the biggest roadblocks, maybe regulatory or in terms of some of these more practical issues?
Some of those, the regulatory issues we're working through. I think it really is the practical construction challenges, right? Because as you stated, many of ours are vacant. They've been vacant for, some of them a decade, some of them several decades. Some of our projects have gotten brownfield dollars because of that. So we can actually support developers that are trying to do these kinds of investments in these facilities. As far as externally, we've had great success in the parking around the structures as well as just infrastructure development externally to the building. The challenges really do come within the facility itself, especially depending upon some of the age of the building.
I would like to move on actually back to Amy. What did it take to obtain public buy-in in support of your project? How, and I know you've talked extensively about this at this point, but I want you to maybe home in on, the community conversation in the city. How did securing public buy-in work for you? Any advice for others, either on the public sector side or on the development side, sort of thinking about this and working on similar challenges?
Before we identify a market, we usually get a market study to support our thoughts. How we got community buy-in, I typically go and get stakeholders in the community and we work with them. And if we're finding that it's going sideways, we usually suggest an advisory committee made up of the seniors and made up of the community itself so that we can design something that the community, makes us an asset to the community and not just go in there and say, we're going to do this. We had a contest for naming the project. And it was a community event. And that tied the community and they gave reasons why. So they were thinking about why this project was important to the community and by thinking of a name and a history.
So with that, I believe I need to turn this back to David. David, thank you for the opportunity and I'll let you close it out.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.